Or so. Looks like 226 to me. What about you, Stuff Rider? Huh? Yeah. Much bigger than John Hoptet. Chris doesn't count. He had to cancel early. He had a couple more people going. Right there.
Yeah, he ditched us.
He ditched you?
He ditched us.
He looked at it.
I thought it finally felt good. It was raining. It was cool.
Oh, yeah? Yeah. What's up with the Park Service? I know it. Start having fun, they pull the plug on you. All right, as soon as we get through with the rap music, we'll get started. No, you go ahead. No, I'll introduce you and then you can set up the thing. Hey, y'all ready to get going?
Yep.
Yes.
All right, let's try to squeeze this thing in. We ready on PCN? Okay. All right, looks like we're hot here. Woo, Lordy, have mercy. I'd like to welcome everybody to Gettysburg National Military Park. We're going to try to squeeze the program in today under these overcast clouds. We'll go as long as we can. We were looking at the radar, and of course it was forecast, not the actual radar. So we hope to get an hour in. If I think we can get the whole program. So today, ladies and gentlemen, we're starting. We're ending the day, I should say, on July 1st of 1863, with a talk about Cemetery Hill, which is obviously the very hill in which you're standing upon, and which the speaker's rostrum in which we're speaking from today. But in 1863, as the sun started to set and it got lower and lower, this hill became more and more important. And so what we'll be doing today is we'll be studying three aspects of it. We will start with the Union perspective. They occupy the hill first, and we will go from there, and then we will go to the Confederate perspective, and we will look at it from the lens of Seminary Ridge, looking across to Cemetery Ridge and Cemetery Hill. And then finally we're going to bring in the human aspect of it with the talk by Codie Eash about the people that are buried here in the National Cemetery today. So I hope you enjoy the presentation. We have three speakers obviously up here, and all of us like to talk, especially me. So, yeah.
I have to tell people to tell me to shut up.
Oh, people tell you?
No, I tell them to tell me.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I do well in a morgue. I don't do anything. I could talk all the time. They wouldn't have any complaints back there. So our first speaker, as I said earlier, is going to be the Union perspective, and it is with an old Ranger, which you're familiar with, but a new Ranger as far as full-time to the staff. And his name is Daniel Welch, and he is all the way from Youngstown, Ohio. And he is glad to be in Pennsylvania. Right here. Like that. Okay, and Dan's just glad not to be seeing school kids in his dreams anymore.
Thank you, Matt. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming to our final program this evening on the 162nd anniversary of the first day of the Battle of Gettysburg, July 1st, 1863. Perhaps you've heard the saying that all roads lead to Gettysburg. And here, on this ground, on July 1st, 1863, all decisions will lead to this hill, Cemetery Hill. As Matt said, we're going to look at how Cemetery Hill becomes wrapped up into the Union Army's defensive position, some of the decisions that are being made at the high levels of command to occupy this hill, and some of the long-standing controversies as a direct result of those decisions. How Robert E. Lee and the victorious Confederate Army, after driving Union forces west and north of town throughout the day's fight, will bring Cemetery Hill into their tactical and strategic planning and operations for the coming day of July 2nd. And ultimately how the aftermath of the first day's fighting, left behind on those fields west and north of town, will eventually have a direct correlation and connection to Cemetery Hill through the establishment of the Soldiers' National Cemetery. My job this evening is to bring the Union Army's focus and focal point and story here to where you now stand and sit 162 years ago. And it doesn't begin here at Cemetery Hill, rather miles to the south of where you're currently located. On the early morning of July 1st, as battle is raging west of town, John Fulton Reynolds, commander of the 1st Union Army Corps, leading his men into combat on the fields west of Gettysburg, has sent word to the commanding officer of the Union Army's 11th Corps, Major General Oliver Otis Howard. He is imploring Howard to get his men up and moving, get them on the march, and get here to Gettysburg. Howard will ride with his men for several miles before turning it over to his next ranking officer. He'll gather up a few of his staff, and by 10:30 on the morning of July 1st, Howard and those several men in his entourage will have arrived to the area of the peach orchard, made famous the following day on July 2nd. There, Howard will be met by a staff officer from General Reynolds, who will explain the situation that's currently taking place on the fields west of town. Howard will share some information about his position, about his men on the march, and will have that same officer ride back to Reynolds to inform the 1st Corps commander of his arrival to the field. But Howard will not remain at the peach orchard long. He'll eventually ride westward from his location to Seminary Ridge. And while on Seminary Ridge, so often in our minds associated with the Confederate Army during the Battle of Gettysburg, while on Seminary Ridge, it is there that Howard realizes he cannot glean much of the conditions of what is taking place during that growing fight west of town. He immediately begins looking for somewhere else in which he can not only gather information on that growing fight, but also to establish a presence here on this battlefield. Upon leaving Seminary Ridge, Howard would ride to what he described as, quote, the highest point of the Cemetery Ridge, obviously meaning Cemetery Hill. From somewhere on this location on Cemetery Hill, he could view out above and beyond the town of Gettysburg itself, and he could see the 1st Corps going into position and going into action. There with him on this hill, all of those decades ago, Howard would turn to his adjutant general, the 11th Corps, a man by the name of Theodore Meisenberg. And he would refer to this hill and he said, quote, "This seems to be a good position, Colonel." Meisenberg replied, "It is the only position, General." And now, for the first time, Cemetery Hill begins to take a level of importance at the high-ranking officers, the high level of command in the Union Army, the Army of the Potomac. Now, Howard and Meisenberg and the others with him that morning would not remain here on Cemetery Hill long. After that quick conversation, he would ride down the hill and its gentle slopes onto Baltimore Street into the town of Gettysburg itself. He's looking for another vantage point of not only what is taking place west of town, but where to place his corps as they arrive here within the coming moments. As he makes his way into town, he bumps into an 18-year-old resident of the town of Gettysburg, a young man by the name of Daniel Skelly. And Daniel Skelly and Howard are going to have a brief conversation there at the corner of Baltimore and Middle Streets. Howard is looking for a point of observation, and Skelly offers up the roof of the Fanstock building located there on the corner of Middle Street and Baltimore Street. Skelly, Howard, and his men will climb up, and they will get a good view looking westward. Within a matter of moments of getting on the rooftop, a staff officer arrives down on the street, and he calls up to Howard, a man by the name of William Riddle, a major on General Reynolds' staff. Riddle yells up to Howard that his commanding officer, Reynolds, had been wounded, and he rides off. Minutes later, another officer, Captain Daniel Hall, arrived. This information even more ominous. The staff officer would yell up to Howard, "General Reynolds is dead, and you are the senior officer on the field." It's at this moment that Howard has an incredible decision to make as to what to do next. Instinct would probably tell us today that we would want to ride out to the scene of the First Corps action. Ride out to this unit that's already engaged. More First Corps soldiers are on the march. They're arriving up the Emmitsburg Road, cutting cross country to Seminary Ridge and deploying west of town. But that's not what Howard did at all. Instead, Howard rode away from the growing battle. He rode back to here, to Cemetery Hill. He would later write in his official report of the battle, it was at this moment that he established his headquarters at the highest point of the hill. And Howard would begin to take over and assume command of not only the First Corps units already engaged, the First Corps units on the march, but to prepare for the arrival of his own corps and where they are going to take position. Now, when Howard arrives up here and he sets up his headquarters, well, one of the things you're probably asking yourself is, why is he establishing his headquarters here? Why Cemetery Hill? Well, there's a lot of benefits to establishing his headquarters here. Benefits that he doesn't have if he was to establish his headquarters west of town or closer to the edge of the western outskirts of town, where he could oversee the First Corps as it was in battle. First and foremost, Cemetery Hill provides an excellent position, not only for his headquarters, but an excellent position for Union officers and men. One of the reasons why Cemetery Hill is such an excellent position, it's hard to comprehend today, as the town of Gettysburg has grown up onto the hill over the last 162 years, as the National Cemetery has kind of obscured some of the tactical importance of this position. But Cemetery Hill is over 100 feet in height in 1863, and it has a view over terrain in any direction in which attackers may approach this position. It has a smooth crest, part of which we occupy this evening, which provides great positions for artillery. It has gentle forward slopes, except from the eastern approaches. This would deprive any attack coming this way from being able to use defilade, or being able to use the terrain to shield incoming fire from any Union soldiers at this location. In addition to that, crisscrossing Cemetery Hill in 1863 are a number of wooden fences, a number of stone walls, positions that can be prepared and strengthened by Union soldiers. It's not surprising then that Howard would not only make this place his headquarters, but he would choose it as a logical plan B. If anything was to go wrong west of town, if anything was to go wrong as his men are arriving and being deployed on the fields north of town, these units on the field could come back here to Cemetery Hill, take these strong defensive positions, and wait for further orders and directions from headquarters in Taneytown, Maryland, 12 miles down this road to your left and rear. Howard will not only establish his headquarters here, he will also make sure that this place is occupied by Union soldiers, detailing one division of his 11th Corps to go into position on this hill, as well as 2 batteries of artillery to drop trail and prepare to defend this location at any extent. Now, as all this is happening here in Gettysburg, 12 miles away from us, down in Taneytown, Maryland, at the headquarters of the Union Army, the new commander, General George Gordon Meade, is meeting with the commander of the Union Army's 2nd Corps, Winfield Scott Hancock. There, these men are engaging in conversation. Meade is not only sharing with Hancock some of the intelligence that has arrived to headquarters over the previous evening and throughout the morning, but he's also sharing with Hancock what he believes are the next steps, or the best next steps for the Union Army to make over the coming day and days. Hancock and Meade have such a good conversation that it's not long afterwards, that after the meeting breaks up and General Meade learns of the wounding and potential death of General John Fulton Reynolds, that Meade, with his Chief of Staff, Daniel Butterfield, will ride to General Hancock's headquarters, now established in Taneytown as well. And there, Meade will have Butterfield prepare orders for Hancock to ride to Gettysburg, to take over command of all of the units here on the field, and to figure out the situation in this surrounding area. Now, it's at that meeting that a problem is quickly discovered, that Winfield Scott Hancock is junior in rank to Oliver Otis Howard. it is unprecedented for a junior officer to come into a situation developing like the one here at Gettysburg and take over command of officers that outrank you. But Meade believes the person best situated to lead the Union Army in the events taking place here is Hancock, based upon that meeting they had had earlier in Taneytown. At 1:10 p.m., Chief of Staff Dan Butterfield writes the orders to Hancock, orders that Hancock will take with him. Hancock will gather several members of his staff. They will get in an ambulance, so they have time to look over the latest intelligence and study maps as they're making their way to the front of this growing action. Meanwhile, back here on Cemetery Hill, after the 1 o'clock hour, Howard has brought some news from the field that's growing and the front that's growing west of town. General John Buford's cavalry troopers that have been fighting west of town throughout the morning have provided some information that Lieutenant General Richard Stoddert Ewell's 2nd Confederate Corps is advancing southward from York with his entire 2nd Corps. With this news, Howard is going to send urgent messages from Cemetery Hill. He's going to send them to General Sickles in Emmitsburg, Maryland, several miles away. He's going to send information and news and orders to Major General Henry Slocum, located at 2 Taverns, to bring up his corps as quickly as possible. And Howard is going to continue to supervise the 11th Corps as well. With those movements underway, Howard will ride through the town of Gettysburg. He'll ride with none other than Major General Francis Barlow of the 11th Corps. He'll see the position north of town as Barlow's men arrive. And there, Howard will then leave and head over to the left flank of the Union Army's position and the left of the 1st Corps. Following that reconnaissance, Howard returns back here to Cemetery Hill. And as the afternoon ticks by, the fighting for the Union Army, west and north of town, is not going well. Some point between 3 p.m., as Winfield Scott Hancock recounts, and 4:30 p.m., as Oliver Otis Howard recounts, General Hancock has arrived on the field, and he arrives here to where you now sit this evening. Now, Hancock's initial impressions of Cemetery Hill and the matters and situation that are taking place, he wrote about, he said, "I presume there may have been about 1,000 to 1,200 at most organized troops of the 11th Corps in position on the hill. Buford's cavalry formation was showing a firm front in the plain just below, in line of battalion and mass. It is my recollection, and below Cemetery Hill, and to the left of the Taneytown Road." Not long after Hancock's arrival, at 4:10 p.m., Oliver Otis Howard will send out orders to the environs of the west and northern approaches to Gettysburg. Orders that had been expected for a while. The orders were to pull back, to retreat. By the time those orders had reached the de facto commander of the 1st Corps in the wake of John Reynolds' death, Abner Doubleday, Double and his men were already on the retreat, making their way here towards Cemetery Hill. Now, the story of the retreat itself is a story for another day. And the story of the retreat is hotly contested. As one soldier would later write, that the story of the retreat through the town of Gettysburg is a story of individuals. Some recalled an organized retreat through the town, men in 4 rows across, rank formation, column marching down the street. Some recalled chaos and confusion, men running everywhere. One eyewitness said there was no organization as far as I could see, neither was there a great hurry. But according to Hancock, when he arrived here on Cemetery Hill, he found General Howard struggling to bring order out of the chaos of the retreat of the Union Army's 1st and 11th Corps. There, Hancock said he saw Howard that was attempting to, quote, stop and form some of his own troops here. What troops he had formed there, I do not know. I understood afterwards and accepted it as fact that he had formed 1 division there prior to this time. It's here that Hancock steps in and starts organizing these masses of men that are arriving in much scattered and depleted units. Now, Hancock's advent upon this hill, as one historian said, did not evoke some miraculous-like immediate return to order. Hancock didn't arrive and started barking orders and immediately order was restored out of the chaos. There was a process to rallying these men. There was a process to bringing organization. One Union observer said the Yankees were, quote, a most unmilitary crowd that Hancock and Howard met and rallied on Cemetery Hill. Organization had temporarily melted away. As the organization by Howard and Hancock continued, a brief controversy, a controversy that's been passed down through generations of Gettysburg historians, begins between Hancock and Howard. Who was in command? The orders that General Butterfield had cut for Hancock, who had placed them in his breast pocket, said that he was to come here to Gettysburg to take command of the soldiers on the field. And once everything was decided, he was to turn that command over to General Henry Slocum upon that corps commander's arrival. When Hancock arrived and first met with Howard, Hancock later recalled that he had a brief conversation with Howard. He asked Howard if Howard wanted to see those orders. Howard said, nope, don't need to see the orders. And the two men began to organize these defeated masses. Elements of the 1st Corps would take position along the western side of Cemetery Hill. The 11th Corps along its eastern side, artillery doing the same. Portions of the 1st Corps sent out to occupy Culp's Hill, as well as some artillery out in that location as well. But this controversy as to whether or not Hancock was in command in the eyes of Howard would continue, as I mentioned, by General Reynolds for decades to come. General Howard. So the controversy between Howard and Hancock boils down to this then. Did General Howard refuse to accept the command, the orders that Hancock carried with him? And what was Howard attempting to accomplish in his numerous post-battle, post-war written justifications about this meeting on Cemetery Hill? The most accepted version of this meeting between the two is from a dubious report of a man by the name of Captain Emil M. Halstead, P. Halstead, the assistant adjutant on General Doubleday's staff. I'm not going to share with you the whole account, but from this account, the controversy begins to grow. And the account basically states that Howard refused to accept Hancock's command, that he told Hancock that he had no authority over him and could not order him to do anything, and that Howard would remain in command of the situation. But this account by one of Doubleday's staff will continue to grow as General Doubleday will weigh in on the story with even further embellishments to actually what happened. When Doubleday later printed his book titled Chancellorsville and Gettysburg, Doubleday offered his most popular version of this controversy about when Hancock and Howard first met. When Hancock finally read Doubleday's book, he made marginal notes, the best of which summarizes the whole affair. This is what Hancock wrote on one of the pages of Doubleday's book regarding this moment, this controversy. Quote, "This is all wrong. General Howard made no objections whatever, and no scene occurred. In conclusion, no doubt, Hancock was sent forward to assume command. And he did it, despite Howard's dismay. It's justified. A junior officer comes and is basically putting you on the bench. But there's no doubt the entire controversy, which we don't have time to get into tonight, was the result of Abner Doubleday's writings and accounts, whatever his objectives may have been for creating that controversy. Now, why would Howard attempt to rewrite those events on his behalf over the subsequent decades of his life? Howard's Gettysburg service was incredibly precious to him. This is a man that is still recovering from the sting of the defeat at Chancellorsville his corps had suffered 8 weeks earlier. Howard is incredibly proud about how he maintained command on the field from roughly 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. upon the arrival of Hancock. His selection of Cemetery Hill as a fallback position for the Union Army that was then pressed into to service. As noted Gettysburg historian once said, Howard's Gettysburg service was dear to him, and he could not force himself to admit anything that would diminish it. As the afternoon turned into evening, and the positions around here solidified, between 5:30 and 6 p.m., Hancock would turn over command of the battlefield to General Slocum, as per his orders. General Howard would do the same at about 7 p.m. At the same time, at 7 p.m., Major Mitchell, an aide on Hancock's staff, arrived to Taneytown, Maryland to report to General Meade. He told Meade how Hancock had positioned units on the battlefield, Cemetery Hill, and would, quote, hold this position until night. By doing this, Hancock offered and afforded General Meade the courtesy of ample time to come here to Gettysburg and to make any changes he may so desire. In conclusion of the role of the Union Army here on Cemetery Hill, the role of Oliver Otis Howard, and the role of Winfield Scott Hancock, there can be no doubt that General Howard was intent on fortifying Cemetery Hill, which was later completed by General Hancock. Howard's foresight of occupying this position, putting his headquarters here, was later noted by a subordinate who correctly stated, quote, Howard selected the position on Cemetery Hill as a rallying point, and the next 2 days of fighting showed the wisdom of his selection, end quote. In fact, according to one recent history and practical evaluation, quote, Hancock, Slocum, and Meade all endorsed Howard's tactical strategic view of the battle and his choice of ground, and no one can gainsay Howard's pivotal contribution to the 3-day struggle, end quote. But it was not enough just to occupy Cemetery Hill. It was not enough to reorganize the shattered remnants of the 1st and 11th Corps. If this position was a void to being what they referred to as turned, when your enemy gets on your flank and in your rear, Union forces had to also hold Cemetery Ridge, the ridgeline extending southward from Cemetery Hill. It would also have to hold Culp's Hill, off to your right and front in the distance. And it was General Hancock that made this happen, sending troops, Wadsworth's division of the 1st Corps, to Culp's Hill, sending troops to Cemetery Ridge, and detailing men from the 12th Corps and 2nd Corps upon their arrival to the Taneytown Road in the far left end of the growing Union line near the Round Tops. Hancock certainly did not act alone in fortifying Cemetery Hill, and he never made such a claim. Yet one Confederate officer noted, quote, with the perception of a great general, Hancock saw the strength of the position, seized upon it, reformed broken corps, and reported to his chief that he had a favorable position. Perhaps the only comprehensible statement that explains the Union fate that day 162 years ago was expressed by an unidentified aide of General Slocum's in the 12th Corps of the Army of the Potomac, who said, on the first day, we were pounded into a splendid position. Those giving that pounding were the men of the 2nd and 3rd Corps of the Army of Northern Virginia, a story that my colleague, Matt Atkinson, will continue.
That's good. See what happens when you stay focused? Stay on topic? Chase rabbits? Funny how that works out. All right. So I'm going to continue the story with the Confederate account, but you know, my account is not about reaching the hill. My account is about not reaching the hill. All right, so I don't really have any physical things to for July 1st as far as that goes. But I think if you're going to understand what happens to the Confederates on July 1st, you have to understand basically what the mental disposition was of Robert E. Lee when he's riding into town on the night of July 1st. When Lee starts the campaign in June of 1863, this is the culmination of everything that he has worked for 2 years. This is everything that he has been striving for. This is why all this blood has been spilled down in Virginia, is to get him to this point until he gets up and he can have a chance to end the war, or to win the war. Now, having said that, he starts his campaign by sliding west from Fredericksburg, and he does it in increments because he doesn't know what the Union Army is going to do. During this time, if you look at the correspondence of Robert E. Lee back to his boss, Jefferson Davis, it is one letter after another asking the president to form more offensive Confederate offensives across the front, Kentucky, Southern Virginia, etc. And he's also asking for Davis to form a army or an imaginary army around Culpeper under the command of Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard. Now, Lee's objective in doing this is to keep Union troops grounded in Virginia, just with the reputation of Beauregard, if nothing else. And it's also to allow him to get up into the north pretty much unmolested. But above all, it is to give a position of strength to the Confederate States of America, the government of the Confederate States of America, to negotiate with Lincoln from a position of strength. As Lee makes the fateful decision to cut loose, he writes Jefferson Davis in June, the latter part of June, and he says, we're going to have to cut loose from our base of supplies, but I think it will bring relief to Vicksburg. And so with the Union Army now heading north, and he knows not south toward Richmond, he orders Longstreet to cross over the Blue Ridge Mountains. He has got Ewell in advance. They win a splendid victory at the Second Battle of Winchester, and he has got A.P. Hill sandwiched in between. And with that, Lee is pot committed. His letters quickly changed from having that imaginary army concentrated in Virginia to inquiries about where his cavalry commander had gone. And that is one of the great what-ifs, which we will never overcome, ladies and gentlemen. I can sit up here and talk till I'm blue in the face about Jeb Stuart or Stonewall Jackson, okay? But neither one was here. One was alive and one wasn't. But neither one was here. And basically, Lee was blindfolded coming into Pennsylvania. Literally blindfolded. He does not know where the Union Army is. With all this in the back of your mind, can you imagine on June 25th of 1863, with the hopes of his nation riding upon him, in a driving rainstorm with the band playing Dixie? I don't know who made the horn tooters get out in the middle of the rainstorm and play Dixie, but I guess there's never a better opportunity. Robert E. Lee turns the horse's head to the Potomac and he crosses. When he gets across the Potomac, there are Maryland women awaiting the new conqueror. And one staff officer said that the lady that came up to make the presentation to Robert E. Lee had a face, quote, like a door knocker. Which I've always imagined. What is a door knocker, Lily? Go look up a door knocker and you'll get a good idea of what's happening here. So anyway, the ladies had this, what do you call the thing when you put around the horse's neck at the Kentucky Derby when they win? You know, the flowers and everything. What's it called?
Wreath.
The wreath? Is it a wreath?
Okay.
They tried to put those flowers around Traveler, and Traveler wasn't having none of it. And Lee, as a conquering general, wasn't having none of it either. And so Lee suggested that they give it to General Pickett. But they wouldn't have any of that. So he handed it off to an orderly. And that's how he rode into Pennsylvania, with his orderly carrying a big bundle of roses behind the commanding general. A couple days later, on June 27th, Robert E. Lee enters Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. And that is an especially important note for you people. Most of you have never paid any attention to this, but the state marker says June 26th. It's June 27th when he enters Chambersburg. Yeah, go figure that. Oh, everybody's getting online now just to be posted first. I've discovered something new about Robert E. Lee right there. And I think in that, ladies and gentlemen, when Robert E. Lee gets to Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, he is beset by civilians that are worried about the conduct of his army. And it is also the first big settlement in which he has come across in enemy territory. When he had crossed into Hagerstown a couple of days earlier, a kid that had come out that had met Robert E. Lee during the Antietam campaign came out to see Lee at Hagerstown, and he recalled as an old man how much Lee had aged since the time of Antietam. Lee entered Pennsylvania and into Chambersburg with a heart problem. He was probably some other physical ailments along with him, and the burden of commanding 70,000 people, basically a moving city. And now the civilians are wanting to know what the conduct of his army will be. Now, I don't have time to get into this, and I could spend 10 to 15 minutes. But I truly think, ladies and gentlemen, if I could get up on my soapbox for a minute, if you want to see what kind of person you are or who you're dealing with, you need look no further than somebody that has power over you or anybody else. When you have power over something, that is when your true colors show. And that is where your true nature is. And Lee would issue on June 27th of 1863 a document which we have heard of a million times but rarely read, and that is called General Order 73. You can find it readily, pretty easily on the internet for all you note takers out there. And Lee proclaims that his army shall not be involved in ransacking Pennsylvania. And he makes a plea to his soldiers to conduct themselves accordingly. Is it perfect? No, it is not perfect. Robert E. Lee can't control 70,000 men. But it shows you what kind of man he really was when he could have taken revenge. And there was a lot of people wanting him to take revenge. And he didn't do it. That, I think, is even in, you can say a lot of negative things about Robert E. Lee, but that is truly one of the positive things that makes him unique. Now, Lee is under a lot of stress, as I've said many times. On the night of June 28th, if he wasn't stressed enough, he is going to have a scout come into his headquarters. At first, he will not meet with this scout. He will be presented to Lee by Lieutenant Colonel Moxley Sorrell, who was Chief of Staff for James Longstreet. And he says, General, this scout has just come through the enemy lines and he has information to report. Apparently, Lee, the information which Harrison reported and Lee first refused to hear personally, he later calls Harrison back and invites him into his tent. It is very unusual for spies to meet with the commanding general. You usually do not allow spies to get that close. But as Dan was texting me earlier, we were talking about the weather out here and whether we were going to get this program in. And if are we going to use one source? That scout, Harrison, when he comes into his tent, is the only source to give Lee the information that the Union Army is now north of the Potomac. And Lee cannot understand why General Stuart has not told him about this. And he is very perplexed by that. But you have to put yourself in the shoes of Robert E. Lee. Can you believe one person? Can you concentrate 70,000 men who are stretched from Harrisburg all the way back across those mountains to your left, to the west? Can you order the concentration of an entire army based on the information of one man? I think the question that comes to Lee is, can you afford not to? And so he orders that concentration. Why does he order that concentration? Because he does not want the Union Army coming behind him. Even though Lee had cut loose from his supply base, he could still use rearmament, another ammunition supply, and that ammunition lies at Winchester, Virginia. That is the nearest rail hub. In order to keep the Union Army away from him and Winchester, between he and Winchester, he decides to concentrate his army on the eastern side of the mountains. And the east side of the mountains are on what side? Gettysburg. That's why he's concentrating over here. And once he gets the army concentrated, he will figure it out from there. Now, so he calls that concentration, and he prepares to ride forward. June 29th, orders went to Ewell to either march on Cashtown or Gettysburg as circumstances might dictate. Remember, Ewell is in the advance. Who does Ewell represent? For you big Civil War buffs, I'll take a deep dive with you. Ewell is the remnants of Stonewall Jackson's old command, and they are known for their marching prowess. The foot cavalry, that is who you put in front of the army so they don't back up the rest of the army. You want the road cleared back. Now Ewell has to turn around, and he's headed back to Gettysburg with discretionary orders. A.P. Hill, the Center Corps, the 3rd Corps, would take the road over the mountain from Chambersburg to Cashtown, with Longstreet following the next day on June 30th. Lee started the morning of July 1st. He moved down the road a little bit to a place called Greenwood, but on July 1st he started with Longstreet's command again. About the time they got to Thaddeus Stevens Iron Works, which the remnants of it are still left on 30 today, they ran into a traffic jam. Johnson's division, remember, Corps, Division, Brigade, Regiment. I might put that on my tombstone. Corps, Division, Brigade, Regiment. If you people hadn't learned that by now, I don't know what to do with you. There are 3 divisions in each Confederate Corps, and there are 3 corps. And 2 of those divisions are already up at Gettysburg for A.P. Hill. That 3rd Division, Johnson, is coming in at a right angles to this intersection, and Lee makes the decision to allow Johnson's division to go ahead. In front of that would be Richard Anderson. In front of that would be Dorsey Pender. And in front of that would be Henry Heath. And behind that is following the 2 divisions of Longstreet. That is 6 divisions, if you're keeping up with me, coming down the Chambersburg Pike. You got to clear the road, people. And so Johnson's division, to keep Hill's command together, is ordered to go forward. Put that in the back of your mind, because I'm about to come back to that when it comes to Cemetery Hill. Now, Lee rides on to Cashtown. He finds A.P. Hill there. As he's crossing into Cashtown Pass, he hears a distant thunder in the off toward the west. What do you think that distant thunder is?
That's Ewell. Buford.
That's right. It's the Union cannons, it's the Confederate cannons, and it's west toward Gettysburg. And Lee doesn't know what it portends. And when he gets to Cashtown, A.P. Hill can't tell him anything. And I don't know what that set Lee off, but I'm sure it didn't help him or his heart condition. General Richard Anderson recalled that Lee listened to the guns in the distance and said, "I cannot think of what has become of Stuart. I ought to have heard from him long before now. He may have met with disaster, but I hope not. In the absence of reports from him, I am in ignorance as to what we have in front of us here. It may be the whole Federal Army, or it may be only a detachment. If it is the whole Federal Army, we must fight a battle here. If we do not gain a victory, these defiles and gorges through which we are passing this morning will shelter us from disaster." Shortly thereafter, Lee rode on toward Gettysburg. He arrives on the field probably between 1 and 2 o'clock, about the time, not shortly thereafter, after Heath had been, initial attack had been reported, and about the time that Rowe's division is deploying at the Peace Light. He comes up to basically where Hare's Ridge is today. I can't give you the exact spot. And he takes out those field glasses. I don't know if they still display them, but there used to be a place called the Museum of the Confederacy, and they had his field glasses on display, and I could sit there in front of that window and just stare at those field glasses that he carried everywhere on the, the things that have been seen through those field, you know what I mean?
I know what you mean.
Oh my God, glory, 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 right there. So here it is. By an eyewitness, on July 1st, General Lee and staff rode east from Cashtown. This is a quote. And about 3 miles from Gettysburg, coming into the open country, he came in sight of the first day's battle. Turning into a grass field on his left, he sat on his well-bred iron-gray traveler and looked across the fields eastward and through the smoke rising in puffs and long rolls. He held his glasses in his hand and looked down the long slope by the seminary and over the town to the rugged heights beyond. A rod or two away I sat in my saddle, and I caught the picture which has not faded from my memory and grows more distinct as the years go by. He was 56 years old, with a superb physique, 5 feet and 11 1/2 inches in height, and about 175 pounds in weight, and in perfect health. I don't know about that. He was a gentleman by blood and breeding. Something else will never be said about me. So truly that he was unmindful of it. He was plain and neat in his uniform of gray, so careful of his dress that there was nothing to attract attention. He wore a hat of gray felt with medium brim, and his boots fitted neatly, coming to his knee with a border of fair leather an inch wide. He was himself a soldier and lived as a soldier in a tent and on the plainest fare. He neither knew tobacco nor cared for wine. He had the quiet bearing of a powerful yet harmonious nature. An unruffled calm upon his countenance betokened the concentration and control of the whole being within. All of which I am not. When Robert E. Lee shows up on the field, reports start coming. As soon as it's known Lee is coming, you got riders coming. Some of this is tried to be portrayed in the movie as the couriers start coming in. What Lee found out quickly is that two of his brigades from his division had been repulsed already, and that Union troops in his front were from the 1st Corps, and they were in heavy numbers. But how many were behind them? We're getting into Cemetery Hill now. How many are behind the 1st Corps? Lee doesn't know. You know, but he doesn't know. You have to put yourself in his shoes. By this time, Rhodes' division is making their first attack from Oak Hill. Heath rode to Lee and urged Lee to let him attack again, since Rhodes was heavily engaged. But Lee replied, "No, I am not prepared to bring on a general engagement today. Longstreet is not up." Rhodes is repulsed. That's going to be O'Neill and Iverson. But around 2 to 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Juba Early's division, and apparently the only man that had the audacity to swear in front of Robert E. Lee, is coming down the turnpike. And as he's coming down the turnpike, he's got a squid of tobacco in his mouth, or a quid, or however you want to look at it. And he is agitating. It's going from cheek to cheek. And that big long white beard which he has on the front is starting to get dyed in, because he's agitated and speaks going everywhere. And when Early comes down the old Harrisburg Road, he sends word up to the future peace light, and he says to Rhodes, "I'm going in, I'm pitching in. How about you support me on the right? On my right." And Rhodes says, "By God, I'd like that. I'd like another shot at these people." And so now you have two Confederate divisions. And just like a wave from the Confederate left to the right, Early goes forward, Rhodes goes forward, and then Lee turns Heath loose for a second attack. And they put simultaneous pressure on the Union line, which by this time, as Dan said, is the 1st and 11th Corps. And it cracks. And they are sent spiraling back toward Gettysburg itself. Lee rides forward to the Seminary, where you might get to see a good museum today if you stop by there. And now we start one of the biggest debates of all time. What should Robert E. Lee do as he looks from the seminary across the town and he sees the Union Army start to reform here on a place called Cemetery Hill? What does he do? There's a lot that you could say about whether he had a chance to take this hill. But I think the question you need to ask yourself from the very beginning, and this is the toughest question for me to ever answer, and I don't even know if I have one for you now. You can get people to come out here and give you an opinion. It's Gettysburg, okay? You can always go, or go down right down here, about 400 yards, you get an opinion in there, especially at midnight. Only a select few will get that right there. Ladies and gentlemen, the first question you ask, was it feasible to try to take the hill? Or as we say, what is the word we learned from Gettysburg? Practicable. Practicable, not practical, madam. Practicable. 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 Right there. If there was going to be an attack, it would have to come from Buell because his corps had entered the town. This is what General Lee wrote in his after-action report. Quote, without information as to its proximity, the strong position which the enemy had assumed could not be attacked without danger of exposing the 4 divisions present, already weakened and exhausted by a long and bloody struggle, to overwhelming numbers of fresh troops. General Ewell was therefore instructed to carry the hill occupied by the enemy if he found it to be practicable. But to avoid a general engagement until the arrival of the other divisions of the army, which were ordered to hasten forward. Now we've got 3 speakers and we've got impending rain right here, and I could go into this order right here and I could go on another 30 minutes, but I gotta be disciplined right here because I don't want y'all to get rained out with Codie. They got free popcorn over at the seminary for movie night. By God, I'm getting an invitation. That's free popcorn. Maybe you sell the popcorn and the movie's free. Is that better?
That's it.
Okay, all right. If popcorn's not free, you check that. Maybe it will be when I get there. Right there. We're gonna have a showing of the life and times of Hank Williams. The Seminary Ridge Museum. Right there. Okay, so Captain James Smith of Ewell's staff, this is his quote about 5 o'clock. I put the, some people give you a time. What time do you put the Union line collapsing? I would say it's 4 to 5. Somewhere in there, the Union Army is going to be collapsing. I gave myself an hour, it should be within the window. About 5 o'clock, this is as it collapsed, I rode with General Ewell and staff into the town square of Gettysburg. The square was filled with Confederate soldiers, and with them were mingled many prisoners, while scarcely a citizen was to be seen. As our corps commander, he's talking about Ewell, old bald head, sat in his saddle under the shade of a tree, I would love to know where that is, a young officer brought from a cellar a bottle of wine, which, everybody perks up now, which the general pleasantly declined, while he chatted amiably with his men and the Federal prisoners gathered about him. It was a moment of most critical importance, more evidently critical to us now than it would seem to anyone then. But even then, some of us who had served on Jackson's staff sat in a group in our saddles, and one said sadly, "Jackson is not here." Now, Dan told me when I got this program together that by God I had to mention Stonewall Jackson. And I have mentioned Stonewall Jackson now. Our corps commander, General Ewell, a true Confederate soldier as ever went into battle, was simply waiting for orders when every moment of time could not be balanced with gold. General Early and General Rhodes, his 2 division commanders, came with great earnestness and animation to tell of the advanced position. They desired General Lee to be informed that they could go forward and take Cemetery Hill if they were supported on their right. So if the Confederates are in the city, if Ewell is in the city, And he says, I am supported on his right. He means over here, to your left, not your right. It'd be your left. They're reversed. They're looking my direction. So he is saying, I will attack that hill if I am supported on the right. General Ewell sent Captain Smith to deliver the message to Robert E. Lee. And upon arrival, General Lee directed me to say to General Ewell, and this is totally Lee. You want to see how Lee spoke? This is old South right here. He said, upon arrival, General Lee directed me to say to General Ewell, quote, he regretted very much that his people were not up to support him on the right, but he wished him to take Cemetery Hill if it were possible. If it were possible, and that he would ride over and see him very soon. Now, I forgot to make this point just a minute ago, but this reminded me right here. I think that there's a difference between what we have clung to in Robert E. Lee's official report about take the hill if practicable, but don't bring on a general engagement. I think that's two different orders. Don't bring on a general engagement was earlier in the day, before they got into a fight. Don't get into a fight whatever you do, but by the time they get into a fight and it's all over with, then I think take Cemetery Hill if possible. Lee always gives discretionary orders. This is something Ewell is not used to. He has served under Stonewall Jackson. Jackson does not give discretionary orders. If you ever study Stonewall Jackson, he'd rather have you shot than give an inch. Meanwhile, Lee's adjutant, they must have crossed each other. Colonel Walter Taylor was headed into town to find Ewell and tell him to take the hill, quote, that this is the message. He then directed me to go to General Ewell to say to him that from the position which he occupied, which would have been near the seminary, he could see the enemy retreating over those hills without organization and in great confusion, that it was only necessary to press those people. That's how Lee speaks. He never refers to the word enemy, Yankee, Northern, those people. A gentleman would never use such language, coarse language as Yankee. Lee wished him to take the hill if possible. In obedience to these instructions, I proceeded immediately to General Ewell and delivered the order. General Ewell did not express any objection or indicate the existence of any impediment to the execution of the order conveyed to him, but left the impression upon mine that it would be executed. All right. And so, Ewell decides down in town that he will await Johnson's division. Now, getting into what Lee's options were, let's rehash. He's got Rhodes, he's got Early's division. You can look up a better map, maybe the Batchelder maps, maybe the Lano maps, maybe the Godfrey map, or whoever else you'd like. Who am I leaving out, Dan? Warren. We like Warren too. We like the Warren maps. Elliott. We like Elliott maps. Right there. You have anything to say? Oh, okay. I think that about covers it all. Rhodes and Early are in the town. And then you have over here A.P. Hill's divisions. You've got Heath and you've got Pender on the right-hand side, and you've got Anderson's division that's coming up. So, what were Ewell's? Let's stick with Ewell right now, the men in the town. What are his options on the first day? Let's chase this rabbit. You people have been bugging me for years to go down and been asking me for years about Stonewall Jackson at Gettysburg. All right, well, let's bring old Jack back. Let's put Superman in charge of him. What are the options for Dick Ewell on July 1st? What can he do? He has three options, in my opinion. He can attack with Rhodes and Early, and possibly Johnson's division. He can attack again. He can possibly get support from A.P. Hill with Anderson's division coming up on his right. That's one option. He could attack the hill. The second option is he could see, some of you can see it back there, I can't see it from here, but that wooded line that you see over to your right in the distance, he could also seize that hill right over there. That is Culp's Hill. So he could attack Cemetery Hill, he could seize this eminence that control this hill, or Ewell could consolidate his gains and do nothing. Remember, people, also, he is burdened, I don't know how much Ewell had specifically, but the Confederate Army is burdened, quote unquote, with about 4,000 Union prisoners from that day. So everything is mass confusion. He doesn't know the organization, he doesn't know the strength of his troops, and he is receiving discretionary orders that he has never encountered before. He is not used to any of this. And Trimble, Henry Kidd Douglas, almost any witness that comes across Ewell talks about Ewell's nervous disposition. And they couch it in different things. Now, you can go on to 1864 and you can get a better reading on Ewell, but I think Ewell is just already
overwhelmed.
He's hit, it's the Peter principle. But we just haven't, history, I know that, but Lee doesn't know that. And it's basically, in some cases, some historians would say it overwhelmed him. Some historians would argue that Richard Ewell made a decision. Some historians would say that Ewell decided not to attack. That he made a decision. It's just not the decision that Lee wanted, right? But he made a decision. So, those are his three options. What did he have in order to do it? During July 1st, there was approximately 23,000 Confederates versus roughly 18,800 Federals and cavalry. Now, Heath, Pender, and Rhodes, about 16,000 men. Quote, 7 of the 10 brigades incurred casualty rates of 35 to 50%. The total for all brigades came to 6,300 officers and men, or about 40%. In fighting the 11th Corps out of Rhodes and Early's division, Gordon's brigade suffered the most, 30%, taking Barlow's Knoll, and overall the Confederate units on that end of the field, the rest of them suffered only about 14%. Out of all the divisions present on the field, Early's was probably in the best shape. Hayes and Avery were not cut up that badly, if you remember. I'm getting deep with y'all. So what are you going to attack Cemetery Hill with? Meanwhile, back in town, due to the pleas of, or not pleas, but the prodding of Robert E. Lee, Walter Taylor, and of course Captain James Smith, Ewell was preparing to move. Campbell Brown wrote this. This is Ewell's stepson. One of the great accounts of the Army of Northern Virginia can be found in Campbell Brown's memoirs. I suggest it, edited by Dr. Jones, who directed my thesis right there. You can go out and sell a few books for him right here. But Campbell Brown's on the staff of Ewell. Now, you have to take it with a grain of salt because it's his stepdaddy. And that could go either way. You're welcome to laugh if you'd like to right there. But he liked Ewell. All right. Early soon appeared, Campbell Brown said, and joined Ewell. And riding ahead, quote, they surveyed the ground and examined the position and force on Cemetery Hill. Having concluded to attack, if A.P. Hill concurred, General Ewell ordered Early and Rhodes to get ready. So Ewell is prepared to go forward if he gets support on his right. Now, remember the order of divisions, which I told you. What did I tell you about that traffic jam at that intersection? I told you I would come back to it. Coming down the Chambersburg Pike is Heath, Pender, Anderson, and Johnson. That means that Ewell's last fresh division is back behind Hill's last fresh division. Now, eventually, Johnson's division will leave the road and go up the old railroad cut, which didn't have any railroad tracks. but they will make that as a shortcut to bypass all the traffic and to get into Gettysburg. And they basically deploy, I wouldn't say deploy, but basically halt the column around the railroad station and along through there. And so that's where they're sitting, but that's going to take several minutes to get up. About this time, and this is a point which most people overlook when they talk about taking Cemetery Hill. About this time, I can't give you the exact minute of it, but sometime after Ewell is focusing on Cemetery Hill, a report arrives from a gentleman named Extra Billy Smith. And Extra Billy, who was known as Extra Billy because he was making a little bit on the side when he was sending the postage between Baltimore and Washington. He put a few extra packages on there for good measure, you know, so they called him Extra Billy on there. Extra Billy Smith, who is a political general, sends word to headquarters that there is a Union force moving in behind Robert E. Lee's left rear. And Ewell has to focus on it. So his whole focus is turned away from Cemetery Hill and this potential Union force that is coming in behind him. We all know, ladies and gentlemen, that that force is not going to materialize, or at least in no great strength to threaten the Confederates. But precious minutes tick by as they find out what the threat is over on the left flank. And so Ewell decides, by the time Johnson comes up, that it is too late. Ewell decides that instead he will make, instead of attacking Cemetery Hill, he will make a focus on capturing this hill over here to his Confederate left, which we now know as Culp's Hill. Now, folks, they send scouts up there. I gotta ease the narrative along here. They send scouts up there. They find nothing. They come back down. We're talking about a one-legged general, folks. I mean, he's not going up on Culp's Hill. I'm not trying to make light of the situation, but he's not going up on Culp's Hill, right? So everything has got to be given verbally to him, right? He's usually laying down, or not laying down, but sitting on the ground, you know, and he would be tied into the saddle. So the report is made that the hill is unoccupied, and Ewell turns around, I'd say about midnight, and he sends troops up to the top of that hill. Well, out of all the places they could have gone, they took the shortest route, and they end up running into the last regiment that had not fought with the Iron Brigade on July 1st, about 300 men, 250, 300 men. And in the growing darkness, ladies and gentlemen, they rip into each other. Flashes go off in the darkness, and those rebels come tumbling back down that hill, and what do they report to General Ewell about Culp's Hill?
Fortified.
They report that the hill is occupied by Federal forces, and Ewell decides not to press the attack. You and I now know, with hindsight as a benefactor, that if he'd have put any pressure on that hill, like hit it from two different directions, they could have routed those Federal troops off Culp's Hill at that point. But he didn't, because he didn't know. That was the fog of war right there. So Ewell decides not to attack. Now, I told you earlier that that Ewell was prepared to attack from the town if he was supported from the right. So the last thing that I will cover here is Anderson's division. Heath, Pender, Anderson, and Johnson coming down the pike. Anderson's division is coming in, and he will be the freshest body of troops nearest to the Confederate Army to get up here. I thought you might be interested in this quote. What happened to General Anderson? Assuming that Anderson left Cashtown at 2:00 p.m. and arrived at Gettysburg about 5 o'clock, that would give him making 6 miles at about 2 miles an hour. That's the way I come up with that. He should be here in time to deploy to the right. After the war, Richard Anderson told a story to Captain Lewis Young, which suggests a motive for his inactive role. General R.H. Anderson told me that hearing our guns early in the day, he was hastening with his division to join us when he was met by a messenger from General Lee with an order for him to halt and bivouac. From General Lee. Surprised at this, he first obeyed the order and then rode on to Gettysburg to see General Lee and learn from him if this message was correctly delivered. That's the way you ask. Was your order correctly delivered, sir? General Lee explained that his army was not all up, that he was in ignorance as to the force of the enemy in his front, and that his, General Anderson's, alone of the troops present had not been engaged, and that a reverse in case of disaster was necessary. Why did A.P. Hill then not choose not to advocate their deployment for another attack? I don't know. But Anderson decides to not go in, and that is probably, to me, ladies and gentlemen, and this is a great what if, and this is as close as you will ever get. I have never been able, in my mind, from a practical standpoint, ladies and gentlemen, reconcile how early and Rhodes were going to attack this hill. They might have done July 2nd, where Hayes and Avery came in. Maybe they could figure that out fast enough in order to do that attack with the sun setting or whatever. I don't know. To me, the best opportunity, with hindsight as my benefactor, is to attack it basically where the modern neighborhood is, behind McDonald's. McDonald's being a modern feature, right over here, that was not here at the time of the battle. But this neighborhood was not here. In other words, Cemetery Ridge, which is back to your left rear, was unoccupied. And if the Confederates seized that ridge on the other side of the parking lot, then Cemetery Hill becomes untenable. Now that's easy for me to say, ladies and gentlemen, because I'll reiterate this and drive it home as much as I can. Lee doesn't know what's behind the hill. Dan just told you where everybody was. But Robert E. Lee, as the sun set on July 1st, cannot see here. And if he deploys a division, or they seize the hill, or he takes a segment of his army and they come up here, what is going to happen to them once they get here? That is in the back of their mind. Now place everything that I put together for you. Put Lee's mindset in that. He is blind from Stuart. He is under a lot of stress, and his army has just gotten into a battle which cost him 5,000 casualties. But once again, Southern arms have been victorious. And now Longstreet is telling him personally that his corps is not up. And Hill is not saying anything. And he could not have known what the real-time casualties were for Pender and Heath. So in conclusion, Edwin Coddington asked 3 questions when he went out as far as July 1st. Going back to Dick Ewell, what troops did Ewell have at his disposal for an immediate attack? That's what you have to ask yourself. Number 2, was Culp's Hill unoccupied for a considerable period as Ewell's critics believed? Number 3, why was the onus to attack placed solely on Richard Ewell instead of somebody else? And I leave that. If you can start to answer that, then you can start to get in to that. And let's look. I'll even speak to the canary in the room right here. What was Stonewall Jackson going to do? You know, no doubt in my mind that he would have been more aggressive, but I don't even know if he could pull it off. People, you can't send infantry down Baltimore Street. Dan's already gone over the force, the artillery pieces, and the infantry strength. The Union Army may be disorganized, but they are a wounded animal right here. So it's all these things that you have to do. I'll read one more quote and we'll introduce Codie. In 1868, I thought this was, y'all might find this interesting. Lee wrote a post-war letter to Major William M. McDonald, a gentleman that had solicited Lee's opinion on a school history he was writing. Can you imagine? About Gettysburg. And Lee responded to this. As to the Battle of Gettysburg, I'm surprised Lee gave him this answer. I must again refer you to the official accounts. Its loss was occasioned by a combination of circumstances. It was commenced in the absence of correct intelligence. It was continued in the effort to overcome the difficulties by which we were surrounded. And it would have been gained could one determined united blow have been delivered by our whole line. As it was, victory trembled in the balance for 3 days, and the battle resulted in the infliction of as a great amount of injury as was received, and in frustrating the federal campaign for the season. Right there. And that is the only consolation which Robert E. Lee would get. One of the greatest what-ifs of the American Civil War, ladies and gentlemen, is right here where you're sitting. What if the Confederates had taken Cemetery Hill? Thank y'all. Sitting down too fast and not doing my job. I'm so happy to get out of here. I got to finish the one for tomorrow, so I'll just be slipping off over here. Okay, so Dan and I's original plan was to have this program at the seminary, and we were going to take a walk across the field and conclude and have Codie here speak at the seminary, but we switched because of parking issues. We didn't know what the weather would be, and we didn't, tearing the field up and the whole 9 yards. So we moved it to here and changed the focus to Cemetery Hill. But this is the first time, or I shouldn't say the first time, this is the first time in a long time, I think probably in 12 years that we've held, at least in my knowledge, that we've held something in conjunction with Seminary Ridge and the Seminary Ridge Museum. And so we are very glad today to have Mr. Codie Eash, who is the Director of Interpretation and Education over at this, did I get it right? He said it was backwards.
Backwards from that, yeah.
Education and Interpretation. I had a 50-50 chance right there. Codie came to see Dan and I the other day to plan for this meeting, and Codie, of course, was punctual, which I was not. And he walked up to the desk, and I was just in the matter of having an independent thought when he walked up to me. And as I looked up at him from the desk, I saw this nice, replete man with nicely coiffed hair that was standing in front of him. And I forgot what my thought was, because I had to focus on Codie there for a minute. So I took him upstairs, and as we sat down in the conference room, and we were waiting on Dan for a few minutes right there, and he was talking to me, and he was so articulate. And my independent thought finally came back to me. And as we were sitting there at the table, I finally remembered what I was about to remind myself. And that basically is, Matt, you stink. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Codie Eash from Seminary Ridge.
Well, thank you so much, Matt. Thank you to Dan for the invitation to join them. Thank you to Chris Gwynn for initially putting us in touch with one another when the idea came up to do something collaborative between Seminary Ridge Museum and Gettysburg National Military Park. I'm so appreciative for this opportunity to join you all this evening. We love working with the National Park Service. We thank the National Park Service and its staff and its rangers here at Gettysburg National Military Park especially. When I first talked to Matt several weeks ago about what we were going to cover this evening, he told me what he and Matt were going to focus on, each respective army, the situation late on July 1st, the situation that is facing these Army commanders at the high levels. And he asked me to add a human interest element to this. And his specific directive was to move the audience. And so no pressure is on me for that at all. But what I would like to do with the time that I have is to focus a bit on the site from which I am coming to you today, from the other side of Gettysburg, talk a little bit about the story that we tell there as a means of introducing what this hill meant, not just to the higher ranking officers of these armies who are in the command of these 160,000 or so soldiers who will fight here at the Battle of Gettysburg, but I want to focus on some of the individual soldiers, their stories, what happens to them as they're retreating through Gettysburg, and ultimately those who pay the final price and will ultimately be buried here in what becomes Soldiers National Cemetery. And I want to focus the latter half of what I'm going to talk about here in the next few moments on some words that are spoken by those who fought on the first day of the Battle of Gettysburg 162 years ago, and those who came here to Cemetery Hill, in some cases came back to Cemetery Hill in the decades that followed, and gave meaning to the sacrifice of these soldiers who gave their lives and shed their blood upon this battlefield. For those who might be unfamiliar, just as a means of context, Seminary Ridge Museum is located in the original building on the campus of what is today United Lutheran Seminary, the historic building we know best as Old Dorm or Schmucker Hall, a structure that has stood since 1832. And for decades before the American Civil War, that is a building that had welcomed students to the Lutheran Seminary from both northern and southern markets, just a few miles north of the Mason-Dixon line. Students who come from different backgrounds, who have entirely different concepts of theology and politics, students and faculty studying and teaching side by side who are abolitionists alongside those who come from slaveholding families. The decades before the American Civil War, as it starts to fracture the nation, is also going to fracture the people of the seminary, the people of Gettysburg, the people who call this place home, the people who study and work here at this really kind of microcosmic level. We can see why the nation split apart in the 1860s and trace that all the way back to the 1830s, the establishment of the seminary. We tell that story at Seminary Ridge Museum, but we also hone in on the fact that the seminary grounds are central to the first day of the Battle of Gettysburg 162 years ago today, as well as that story of Civil War medicine in a building that was itself not only a part of the battle, but was a place that was key to the story of Civil War medicine, medical care, and trying to mend these patients who were being treated as a result largely of the first day's battle. I invite you, if you have the opportunity while you're in town, to come visit us at Seminary Ridge Museum. We're open 9 to 5 daily, and we do have several anniversary programs that are taking place over the next several days as well. Feel free to see me at the end. I have some printout copies of our schedules and some other events that we'll be talking about on that side of town. Matt, of course, talked a lot about what Robert E. Lee's decisions are, what's facing him. And by and large, the ground on which Lee is making those decisions and those observations is that which surrounds the seminary building and buildings, 3 of which are there originally at the time of the battle, just across the street, of course, from the Mary Thompson House, designated Lee's headquarters there and the grounds surrounding it. The seminary grounds are a fascinating piece of the first day's battle because they are entirely surrounded by both armies. And in fact, we would be remiss if we didn't find, it would be hard to find a place on this battlefield that has more swirling around it, more purposes that it is given throughout the course of this battle than at the Lutheran Seminary. The building is first used as an observation post by U.S. Signal Corps officers, most famously by Brigadier General John Buford in command of the 1st Division of Federal Cavalry. It will become a U.S. artillery platform, a U.S. infantry defensive position. Eventually, a U.S. general's headquarters in the form of Abner Doubleday establishes his 1st Corps headquarters inside the seminary building for a peace of July 1st. We see it as a reserve position where men are going to be placed on the western side of the campus, where a barricade is hastily constructed late in the morning and early in the afternoon, ultimately put to use later in the day during the final Confederate attack against Seminary Ridge. And of course, perhaps the most important purpose of all that the building and its surrounding grounds will serve, that as a place of refuge for hundreds of wounded soldiers, initially only of the U.S. 1st Division, 1st Corps, but ultimately in the weeks and the months that follow, a general hospital for men of both armies to be treated side by side. On the first day of the battle, what we typically associate the seminary with is John Buford's use of that cupola, John Reynolds arriving, meeting with Buford. But as we go throughout the day, we can see stories of people who are at the lowest ranks and students who are studying at the seminary making use of that cupola for observation purposes as well. And suddenly, by the time we get to the 4 o'clock hour, everything that I laid out a moment ago, being used for Union purposes, does a total 180. And as the Seminary barricade position falls, and as Union artillery begins to fall back from Seminary Ridge, now we suddenly will see, if we were looking at a map, lines of blue are suddenly replaced with lines of gray. And after Lee rides up and establishes his headquarters and an observation on the eastern slopes of Seminary Ridge, now suddenly we see situations in which those who had previously defended Seminary Ridge are forced to withdraw back through Gettysburg. People like Charles Hunt, who gives us this remarkable story as a lieutenant in the 5th Maine Artillery, of talking about how that morning he had told one of his officers that if ever he was wounded in a battle, he hoped that it might be a battle fought near Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. And in fact, he is wounded in the thigh. It's a minor wound. It won't require surgery or amputation. It doesn't strike his bone. He will limp through Gettysburg during the unit's withdrawal through town. And it becomes clear to the other men in the unit why he wanted to be wounded if ever he was at a place near Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. And it's because he approaches the Gettysburg Bank on York Street, knocks on the door, and there his brother-in-law and his sister will answer the door. They're going to hide him inside of the bank vault, and on top of a piano, a surgeon is going to remove the bullet or the shrapnel that had caused Charles Hunt his wound, and there he'll remain during the Confederate occupation of Gettysburg. Or people like Catherine Mary White Foster, a Gettysburg resident on Washington Street, who will get a knock at the door from a soldier in the 151st Pennsylvania looking for a place of refuge, much like Charles Hunt, as Confederate forces are now taking the streets of Gettysburg. But at the Lutheran Seminary, which had been established as a field hospital as early as 10 o'clock in the morning by Dr. George New, Surgeon-in-Chief of the 1st Division, 1st Corps, as well as the 7th Indiana Infantry, there we're going to see, by the time that the Union Army is beginning its withdrawal from Seminary Ridge, nearly 200 wounded U.S. soldiers now suddenly trapped behind Confederate lines. One of them is Lieutenant Colonel George McFarland, in command of the 151st Pennsylvania, affectionately known to him and to us today as the School Teachers Regiment. McFarland himself, a former school teacher and school principal. He is struck through both legs during the withdrawal from Seminary Ridge. He makes his way into the northern end of the seminary building, being carried by one of his privates. And as he's being carried in by Private Lyman Wilson, McFarland says the Confederate forces are coming into the south end of the building, that it is changing hands that rapidly. McFarland and others will talk about the fact that throughout that evening 162 years ago, there's not going to be any food, any water, any medical instruments left behind for these federal troops. It's all stripped from the building, we would presume, to take primarily to Confederate field hospitals. And these men are going to be left without any sort of care, lying in their own pools of blood, under armed guard by Confederate forces, a mile separated from their own men back here on Cemetery Hill. One of the soldiers who is in the seminary hospital is Jeremiah Hoffman of the 142nd Pennsylvania. And he will recount in the 4 years after the battle that he is going to inquire one of the Confederate guards about the opportunity to place something at the top of the building that would indicate to Union artillery back here on Cemetery Hill that there are wounded men inside of that building. The Confederate officer who's serving as the guard permits him the opportunity to do so. And soldiers in the 142nd Pennsylvania will go about the seminary building. They do not find a hospital flag available to them, traditionally yellow during the Civil War, but they do find a red petticoat belonging to Mary Ziegler, the matron or caretaker of the seminary building. And these soldiers are going to tear off as large a square as they can of this petticoat and hang it over a banister of the cupola. In the days that follow, in the hours that follow, really, by the next day, there's an additional hospital flag placed upon the home of Samuel Simon Schmucker, the seminary's founder and first president. A Confederate officer, Eugene Blackford from the 5th Alabama, starts talking with some of the Schmucker family and learns that they have a common cousin that they share in Lynchburg, Virginia. And here we can see a classic case, not of brother against brother, but of cousin against cousin. The wife of an abolitionist minister in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, meeting with a cousin of hers in command of the 5th Alabama, and a hospital flag being placed over top of their house. Here on Cemetery Hill, members of the U.S. Christian Commission would later talk about looking from Cemetery Hill towards Seminary Ridge. and seeing that there was a lot of Confederate artillery surrounding the seminary buildings, which are going to attract a lot of fire from this hill in the days that follow, wreaking a lot of havoc and damage upon those structures. Charles Coffin, a Boston newspaper correspondent, goes to the top of the Evergreen Cemetery gatehouse, and he can clearly see what he describes as a hospital flag flying from the top of the seminary cupola. Many of the command and communication decisions and observations that are made throughout July 1st happen with officers such as Lieutenant Aaron Jerome of the U.S. Signal Corps looking from the seminary cupola to here at Cemetery Hill. And on one occasion, he brings a note, a verbal order, with him here to General Oliver Otis Howard. The connections between the two places are instrumental to our understanding of the battle and of especially the afternoon and evening of July 1st, 1863. But of course, in the aftermath of the battle, in the months that followed, this particular piece of this landscape would not become best known, at least this side of the hill, for what happened here on July 1st and the days that followed, but because of what happens here November 19th, 1863, and the dedication of Soldiers National Cemetery. In the seminary hospital, in the months that follow the battle, we've been able to identify 493 individuals, and that number is growing as we learn more and more about the men who were in that hospital. It's about a 90% U.S. hospital. We only know the names of just shy of 60 Confederate patients who were there. 79 of those 493 men are confirmed deaths in and around the seminary building. 36 of those men who paid the ultimate sacrifice are buried here in Soldiers National Cemetery, including 27 who served in units that fought on this field 162 years ago today, July 1st, 1863. I wanted to focus on a couple of those men, and I chose 3 of them in particular. They happen to all be from Wisconsin, from Iron Brigade regiments. But remarkably, when we start to parse down what we do know about soldiers who were treated at the seminary hospital or hospitals at all on this battlefield, and when we start to winnow that down a little bit more to who is buried here, we only find that there are 3 of these men who we've been able to identify photographs of. And aside from the written record, of course, the best way we can connect with the people of the past is to look into their eyes. So a brief note on a few of these men who are buried in the ground just in front of you and behind me. This is Private Francis M. Bull. He went by Frank. He was from Company I of the 7th Wisconsin. We don't know his exact age. He's wounded in the thigh and ankle, and he'll succumb to that wound 8 days after receiving it, dying at the seminary hospital on July 9th, 1863. He is still listed in several newspapers around his hometown in Wisconsin as being wounded as late as July 21st and 23rd, nearly 2 weeks after his actual death. People at home still think that Frank Bull is alive in a Gettysburg hospital. This is Corporal John Christie of Company F of the 2nd Wisconsin Infantry. He appears to be about 20 years old, as best we can tell. He's wounded in the right foot. He'll die 3 days after the man we mentioned a moment ago, Frank Bull. He's going to die on July 12th, 1863. But likewise, as late as July 22nd or 23rd, we can still see records in Wisconsin newspapers suggesting that he is still alive, that he is still being treated as a wounded patient at the seminary hospital, though he had succumbed to that wound days earlier. And this is John Scott, also of the 2nd Wisconsin, another Iron Brigade unit of Company D of that regiment. We likewise do not know his exact age, but he appears to be about 20 years old as well. He's wounded in the right leg. He dies at the seminary on August 5th. The hospital at the seminary remains open until September 16th, one of the longest serving general hospitals here on the Gettysburg battlefield, and the largest field hospital that was actually inside of a building here on this battlefield. One of our staff members, Director of Museum Operations, Caleb Kuzmierzik at the museum, this is one of the soldiers he has really taken a liking to in a series that he does called Treated at the Seminary. And I asked him this afternoon, I said, if I were to tell these folks one thing about John Scott with the time that I have, what should it be? And he immediately said to me, mention the fact that when his mother dies, leaving his father a widower several decades later, one of the only points that is mentioned in her obituary is that her son died at the Battle of Gettysburg, and that was one of the proudest things of her life, was that she had a son who gave his life here on this battlefield. These are just 3 of the men who are treated at that hospital. Just 3 of the 3,500 graves that we see here on the slopes of Cemetery Hill in Soldiers National Cemetery. And I think it's an important reminder as we honor this battle each year by coming here to this place on these days, that for several of these people, when they looked at this sky, when they looked at these fields, and they were wounded and taken into a building, into a tent, into a hospital of any sort, in many instances, that was the last day that they ever saw the outside world. Whether they lived for a couple of days or a couple of weeks, they recover temporarily, but they ultimately never leave this battlefield. And many of them, of course, are buried here in the ground behind me and in front of you. George McFarland survives his wound at the seminary after being shot through both legs July 1st. Largely, he survives through the heroism of a local Gettysburg woman named Elizabeth Kritzman. And Lizzie Kritzman, as she was known, she will smuggle, in some fashion, a surgical kit from local Gettysburg physician Dr. Robert Horner through Confederate lines and into the seminary, where a life-saving amputation is performed on McFarland on July 3rd. But he will ultimately succumb to his wound in his remaining leg, not in the days after the battle, the weeks after the battle, or the months after the battle, but in 1891 in Georgia, seeking treatment at a medicinal spa. George McFarland succumbs to his wound, and he dies, doctors determine, of complications related to the Gettysburg wound he sustained on this battlefield a mile to the northwest of us on July 1st, 1863. But McFarland, in the 28 years that he does survive after this battle, gives voice to the fallen repeatedly. He comes back several times, and he utilizes his official report, typically an opportunity for soldiers, for officers to reflect on a tactical and strategic level. But George McFarland recognizes that this is the last and only official report he would have the opportunity to write. And as he reflects upon the fact that he lost 3/4 of his men on this battlefield on July 1st and July 3rd, 1863, he decides that he wants to use that official report, and he wants it to rise above the level of just being a recitation of military fact. And he says this in his official report: "I regret the loss of the many gallant patriots who lost their lives or received honorable scars in its ranks, but I rejoice it was in the Battle of Gettysburg, in defense of human freedom and Republican institutions." Likewise, Oliver Otis Howard, who, as Dan mentioned, makes observations from the seminary, has a presence there for part of the day, and selects this as the position to place a division to be the ultimate fallback for the Federal Army. 160 years ago this week, Oliver Howard returns to Gettysburg on July 4th, 1865, the first Independence Day after the end of the American Civil War. And his goal in being here at Gettysburg is to dedicate the cornerstone of Soldiers National Monument in the distance. It's a 4-year process. It won't be formally dedicated until on this day, July 1st, in 1869, when George Meade returns to Gettysburg and is the keynote orator. But 160 years ago this Friday, on the 4th of July, Oliver Otis Howard, just like George McFarland, just like many others, gives voice to the fallen upon this hill. And he says this: "The maimed bodies, the multitude of graves, the historic fields, the monumental stones like this we are laying today, after all, are only the meager memorials of the soldier's work. God grant that what he, the soldier, planted, nourished, and is now preserved by his blood, I mean American liberty, may be a plant dear to us as the apple of the eye, and that its growth may not be hindered till its roots are firmly set in every state of this Union, until the full fruition of its blessed fruit is realized by men of every name, color, and description in this broad land." In the immediate aftermath of the Battle of Gettysburg, at the Lutheran Seminary, just like on many other locations around this town, there's a conversation that turns into a controversy, and two camps are formed. How do we properly honor the dead? How do we properly honor this as a battlefield? What do we do? What do we preserve? Do we move on? What do we fix? What don't we fix? And at the Lutheran Seminary, those conversations will tear apart the faculty. Samuel Schmucker, the seminary's founder in 1826, still its president during the battle in 1863, he will retire from that service in 1864. His successor is going to be James Allen Brown. a fascinating figure in his own right on many fronts. He's one of those figures who we can really kind of look at the entirety of the Civil War era in the form of one man. He's a Pennsylvania-born clergyman who is serving as the president of Newberry College in South Carolina when calls for secession ring out in late 1860. He decides that he's going to resign his position and move back north, and he enlists as the regimental chaplain of the 87th Pennsylvania Infantry. In the months before the Battle of Gettysburg, throughout the summer of 1863, he is the chaplain at the York General Hospital in York, Pennsylvania, about 30 miles to the east of us, my hometown personally. And he is the man who is called upon by the General Synod of the Lutheran Church to succeed Dr. Schmucker as the second president of the Lutheran Seminary at Gettysburg. Well, how does that fit into this story? Well, it's in 1868, Decoration Day, what we now know as Memorial Day. Gettysburg, like the rest of the nation, is commemorating the first official Decoration Day on May 30th, 1868. And appropriately, Gettysburg's Decoration Day ceremony is going to be a parade through the town, followed by a ceremony right where we're gathered now in the Soldiers National Cemetery. And they will select Reverend James Allen Brown, president of the seminary, veteran chaplain of the American Civil War. Now, 5 years removed from the battle, they will make him have the honor of being the keynote speaker on this occasion. When I brought this up to Dan and Matt the other day, they asked, how long is the speech? And I said, it's not terribly long. It takes about 5 minutes to read. And they said, go ahead and do the whole thing. And so this is what James Allen Brown said upon this field, May 30th, 1868, basically right where we're standing right now. Bear in mind, the war is still fresh. Bear in mind, he's a man who has seen this war. He's coming at it from a perspective filtered through the lens of living in the time that he did, seeing the things that he saw. But this is what this hill meant to him about 5 years after this battle. We have come to do honor to the noble dead, to strew with flowers the graves of those who died, that we and the nation might live. We have come not in midwinter or with cypress reeds, but in springtime, when the fields are green and the flowers blooming and birds singing, that in sympathy with universal nature, we might bring our grateful offering of reverence and affection. 7 years ago, looking back to 1861, and hundreds of thousands who now sleep in soldiers' graves were pursuing their peaceful avocations at home. When their country called, they left home and loved ones to uphold their country's flag and their country's honor. As they heartily bade farewell, they were assured that they would be cherished at home, and if any left children behind, they should be the children of the Republic. Here on this hill, they met the hosts of rebellion and treason, and here thousands laid down their lives for freedom and the Union. The price of their death was victory and the safety for us and the nation. The pledges given to the noble soldiers of the Union we have now come to fulfill, to keep alive their mourners and strew with flowers their graves, their orphaned children, the representatives of 500,000, would strew these flowers upon the graves of their fathers, and the nation would recognize them as their own. The noble dead who fell here and on the neighboring hills need no eulogium from our lips. They have secured the proudest of all earthly honors, and their tombstones bear this inscription: they died for their country. There is no danger that they will be forgotten. They live in the hearts of more than 20 millions of citizens of this great republic. From all sections of the land, from across the ocean, and from the isles of the sea, do pilgrims visit this hallowed spot. Not only soldiers and comrades in arms, but statesmen and patriots, gray hairs and tender youth, young men and maidens come and will continue to come. These flowers to be strewn tell that their death was beautiful and fragrant. It is noble and beautiful thus to die for one's country, and the whole land is fragrant from the odor of their heroic deeds. The blessings of peace and prosperity which we enjoy, they have secured for us. Ours is a debt of gratitude which no words or actions can ever express. But long as the Union lasts, and may it be perpetual, let a grateful people visit their resting place. And he concludes with a small bit of poetry. Strew flowers, sweet flowers, on the soldiers' graves. For the death they died, the nation saves. 'Tis sweet and glorious thus to die. Hallowed the spot where their ashes lie. In the years and the decades that follow, that one cornerstone of Soldiers' National Monument, dedicated in 1865, that turns into a full monument in 1869, at which people like James Allen Brown speak. Of course, that is going to build up into the 1,300 or so monuments, markers, memorials, and tablets that are across this field today. And most of these go up in the 1880s and the 1890s, the era of monumentation around the 25th to 35th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. Many of those monuments are dedicated on the days of the battle, appropriately so, and especially around the 25th anniversary. And so I'm going to give the last word to a man who I mentioned a couple of times, George McFarland, who fights on this battlefield, who is leading a group of men, a regiment that suffered 74% or so losses throughout the first and third days of the battle, who himself is a casualty of this battle, and though we do not officially classify him as a fatality of the Battle of Gettysburg, he succumbs to his wound. It just takes him nearly 3 decades to do so. But 3 years before he dies of that wound in 1891, he makes what might have been his final trip here to the Gettysburg battlefield. And he does so on this day, then the 25th anniversary of the battle, 137 years ago, on July 1st, 1888, and he ends his address at the dedication of the 151st Pennsylvania Monument on McPherson Ridge by saying this: "But I must close. Dear comrades, many of us have met each other today for the first time since the battle, and we may never see each other again. We can return to our homes feeling satisfied with our record and grateful to the great state whose sons we are for the handsome monument we've permanently marked the spot so sacred to us all. These thoughts will serve to soothe the evening of our lives. But as we fight the battle over with our friends, let us not forget to impress upon all, especially the young, the great principles for which we fought and suffered." Thank you all so very much, and thank you to Gettysburg National Military Association.
Looks like you held the rain
If
off.
y'all wanted fireworks or whatnot, but I think that's all, folks. We have programs tomorrow at 10, 2, and 6. Please check your website if you haven't, and please join us tomorrow. Y'all be safe out there tonight.
Oh, yeah.